History is not made only by what was written down. It is also shaped by what was never recorded. Across the ancient world, entire lives pass without names. Tombs are sealed with no inscriptions. Cities are built with no explanation left behind. And graves are filled, but no one says why. These are not legends, and they are not missing because they were forgotten. They are missing because the record itself goes quiet. Archaeology can uncover stone, bone, and earth, but sometimes what it reveals most clearly is absence. Tonight, we explore 7 ancient mysteries defined not by what they tell us, but by what history chose not to say. This is Riddle Me This Mysteries, where silence becomes the clue. In Egypt, pyramids were not built casually. They were statements of power, resources, and recognition, reserved for kings, and only rarely for queens whose status was beyond question. At Saqqara, the royal necropolis west of Memphis, most of what lies beneath the sand has been studied, mapped, and catalogued for generations. Very little there is supposed to surprise anyone anymore. And yet, in the early 2020s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a pyramid complex that did exactly that. The excavation was not driven by legend or speculation. It was part of a systematic Egyptian mission, examining burial zones near the pyramid of King Teti, a well-documented ruler of the 6th dynasty. The work moved slowly, layer by layer, through shafts, collapsed masonry, and reused stone. Nothing about the site suggested that it would change what historians thought they knew, until inscriptions began to appear. Carved into fragments of walls and relief blocks was a name, Neith. It appeared more than once, not as a passing reference, but as a formal designation. Titles accompanied it, the language of queenship, carved in the restrained official style of royal monuments. This was not an honorary mention and not a later addition. The name belonged to the person for whom the complex had been built. What the team had uncovered was not just a tomb. It was the remains of a pyramid complex, including architectural elements associated with royal burials, temple structures, storage areas, and traces of ritual spaces. Even in its ruined state, the layout spoke clearly. This was a burial intended for someone of the highest rank. The material evidence was unambiguous. A queen had been laid to rest here. Her name was not unfamiliar in Egypt. Neith was the name of one of the oldest goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon, associated with creation, warfare, and protection. Queens were sometimes given names drawn from divine figures, but this carried weight. Names like this were chosen deliberately, and they were recorded carefully. And that is where the story begins to fracture. When Egyptologists searched for Queen Neith beyond the walls of her burial complex, they found nothing. Her name does not appear in surviving king lists. She is absent from known queen genealogies. Administrative texts that record royal households make no clear reference to her. No inscriptions elsewhere name her as wife, mother, or regent to any known king. For a moment, the evidence seems complete. A pyramid, titles, a royal name carved in stone. Then historians look outward and the record goes quiet. This silence is not trivial. Egyptian royal documentation was not perfect, but queens associated with pyramids were usually anchored to dynasties, marriages, or reigns. Even in periods of political instability, royal women rarely vanished entirely from memory. Yet Queen Neith stands alone, fully present in stone, and almost entirely absent everywhere else. Archaeologists can place her approximately in time. The style of construction, the reuse of materials, and the surrounding burials suggest a date near the end of the Old Kingdom or the opening of the First Intermediate Period, an era marked by fragmentation and the weakening of centralized authority. Record-keeping declined, regional power increased. Some names were lost, but context does not explain everything. A queen with the resources to commission a pyramid complex was not an invisible figure in her lifetime. She commanded labor, materials, and ritual authority. Priests served her cult. Builders shaped stone for her burial. Her name was carved with care, and yet beyond the boundaries of her tomb, history does not acknowledge her existence. What remains is a contradiction carved into the desert floor. A royal woman important enough to be buried like a queen, and quiet enough to leave no voice behind. If even Egyptian royalty could pass into silence, then anonymity in the ancient world may not have been the exception historians once imagined, but something far more common. And beyond Egypt, there are another tomb, just as carefully prepared, just as richly adorned, and just as unwilling to say who it was built for. This burial was never meant to be discreet. Every element of the tomb suggests intention, not just to bury a body, but to present a life. The chamber was carefully cut into stone. Its interior was arranged, balanced, and prepared for viewing, and across its walls scenes were painted not in haste, but with deliberation and skill. Banquets unfold in profile. Figures recline as musicians play. Attendants stand in measured poses, frozen mid-gesture. This is not an image of death. It is an image of continuity, a social world projected beyond the grave. The tomb lies on the Karaburun Peninsula in western Anatolia, a region shaped by movement and exchange. Here, coastlines opened toward the Aegean and cultures overlapped. Local Anatolian traditions, Greek artistic language, Persian administrative reach. It was a place where identities were negotiated, not inherited automatically. The tomb belongs firmly within that world. Archaeologists date it to the late classical period, around the 5th to 4th century BCE. Its architectural form fits elite burial practices of the time. Its paintings reflect wealth, access to trained artisans, and an understanding of visual storytelling. Nothing about the site suggests improvisation. This was a burial planned well in advance, funded with confidence and executed with care. The walls speak clearly about status. Scenes of feasting were not decorative flourishes in the ancient Mediterranean. They were declarations of rank, of social belonging, of legitimacy. To be shown reclining at a banquet was to be shown as someone who mattered, someone entitled to remembrance. Music, servants, and ordered space reinforced the same message. This individual lived a life worth preserving. And yet the tomb refuses to tell us who that individual was. There are no inscriptions, no names carved into stone, no titles, no lineage, no dedicatory phrases. Not even a fragment that might once have carried identity. This absence is not the result of erosion or damage. The walls are intact enough to preserve paint. The compositions remain legible. If text had been present, traces would likely survive. Instead, there is nothing. A silence that feels deliberate, or at least absolute. At first glance, this seems contradictory. Elite tombs of this period usually anchor memory through language. Even when artistic programs dominate, names often appear somewhere. On thresholds, on lintels, on offering tables. Identity mattered, especially to those who could afford to monumentalize it. Here, identity is missing entirely. This is the moment where the mystery sharpens. The tomb does not suggest anonymity in life. Everything about it argues the opposite. The individual buried here commanded resources. Labor was mobilized. Skilled painters were employed. Ritual knowledge guided the imagery. A social world was recreated in pigment and stone. And yet, beyond the tomb itself, history does not acknowledge this person's existence. There is no known text that refers to them, no record in regional inscriptions, no mention in administrative documents, no later memory preserved through copying or retelling. The tomb stands alone, eloquent in form, silent in attribution. It is tempting to explain this away through historical instability. Western Anatolia during this period experienced political shifts, changing allegiances and uneven record-keeping. Power moved quickly. Some families rose and fell within a generation. Archives were not always preserved, but context only explains how silence becomes possible, not why it becomes total. An individual capable of commissioning such a tomb did not vanish quietly in their own time. Their life intersected with others. Their authority was recognized. Their presence shaped decisions, relationships, and obligations. Even if later records were lost, some trace would normally remain. Instead, what survives is a carefully staged farewell, with no name attached. The tomb presents us with a paradox, a life rendered visible through art, yet invisible in history. Memory was constructed but not secured. Commemoration occurred but remembrance failed. And this forces a broader question. If a person important enough to be celebrated in death could disappear so completely from the written record, then silence in ancient history may not mark insignificance. It may simply mark absence of survival, of texts, of names, of voices fragile enough to be lost. The painted figures still recline. The musicians still play. The scene remains frozen, waiting for an identity that never arrives. In other cases, memory was not painted or implied. It was carved at monumental scale, yet still left without explanation. Across much of Neolithic Europe, monuments turn their gaze upward. Stone chambers, corridors, and circles are aligned with the rising sun, the setting sun, or the slow rhythm of the moon. The sky becomes a calendar, a guide, a source of order. Here that expectation quietly collapses. In the wide valley of Antequera in southern Iberia, the land itself dominates the view. The horizon is not empty. A massive limestone formation rises from the plain, La Peña de los Enamorados. From a distance, its profile resembles a human face lying on its back, unmistakable once seen. It is impossible to ignore, especially from the valley floor. This landscape was not neutral to the people who lived here thousands of years ago. It framed daily movement, defined distance, and imposed itself on vision. Long before stone was cut and arranged, the mountain was already present, fixed, permanent, and visually commanding. At the heart of this valley stands the Dolmen of Menga. Menga is not a delicate structure. It is one of the largest megalithic tombs in Europe, built from colossal upright stones, some weighing up to 170 to 180 metric tons. These blocks were quarried, transported, positioned, and raised without metal tools or wheeled vehicles. The chamber they form is spacious, designed not to be sealed forever, but to be entered again and again. Nothing about Menga suggests accident. Archaeologists date its construction to roughly 3800 to 3600 BCE during the Neolithic period, when farming communities had begun to reshape both land and society. This places Menga centuries before Stonehenge and among the earliest monumental constructions on the continent. Its builders understood planning, geometry, and long-term coordination. The monument could not exist without deliberate intent. And yet, the most deliberate choice lies not in its size, but in its direction. The long axis of the Dolmen of Menga does not point toward a solstice sunrise. It does not align with an equinox. It does not follow the moon. Instead, the entrance and corridor are aimed directly at La Peña de los Enamorados. Standing inside the chamber and looking outward, the mountain fills the line of sight. This orientation is precise. Measurements confirm it was not incidental or approximate. The builders did not miss the sky by chance. They chose the land. This is where the mystery settles in. Elsewhere in Neolithic Europe, celestial alignment dominates interpretation. The movement of the sun and moon offers repeatable events, predictable markers of time and season. But at Antequera, the primary reference point is a mountain, a fixed feature of the earth, not the heavens. That choice demands explanation, and none survives. This is not because the builders lacked astronomical knowledge. Just a short distance away stands the Dolmen of Viera, whose corridor aligns much more conventionally with the sunrise. And nearby, the Tholos of El Romeral, built later, follows a different logic again, blending landscape and solar orientation. The people of Antequera clearly understood multiple systems of alignment. Menga's direction was not a limitation, it was a decision. At this point, the question shifts. It is no longer about engineering or capability. It becomes a question of meaning. Why elevate a mountain above the sky? Why anchor a monument of such scale to a feature of the land rather than a celestial event shared by all? Archaeology can take us only so far. Recent research has shown that the area around La Peña was not empty in the Neolithic period. Evidence of human activity has been documented on its slopes, suggesting that the mountain itself may have held significance beyond its appearance, but no inscriptions survive. No symbols explain its role. No oral tradition from the builders was ever written down. What remains is stone, arranged with care, aligned with purpose, and stripped of explanation. This is the particular silence of Antequera. Unlike a forgotten name or a lost biography, this silence does not erase a person. It erases intention. The builders left behind a monumental statement, yet withheld the words that would allow us to understand it. Meaning must be inferred from orientation alone, from what the monument chooses to face. The dolmen still stands, the mountain still dominates the horizon, the alignment remains exact. But the reason it mattered, why this mountain, why this direction, is gone. Elsewhere, stone was shaped just as deliberately, but with no orientation at all to explain its purpose. Some monuments explain themselves. They announce who built them, why they were raised, and which beliefs they were meant to serve. Ellora does none of that. Carved into a long basalt cliff in western India, the site does not rise above the landscape. It cuts inward, transforming a single rock face into something vast and deliberate. There is no central axis, no singular entrance, no moment where the complex reveals itself all at once. Instead, Ellora unfolds gradually, cave by cave, as if meaning were meant to be encountered in fragments rather than declared. This is not a single monument, it is a system. More than 30 rock-cut caves line the cliff, extending across nearly 2 kilometers. Each was excavated directly from living stone. No blocks were assembled. No walls were stacked. The architecture was created by removal, not construction, an irreversible act that required absolute confidence in design before the first strike of the chisel. What makes Ellora remarkable is not only its scale, but its duration. These caves were not created in a single burst of devotion. Work continued here for roughly 4 centuries. Generations returned to the same cliff, reshaping it again and again, committing labor and skill to a place already marked by those who came before. And still, no explanation survives. The earliest caves at Ellora are Buddhist. They are monastic spaces, quiet, restrained, designed for meditation, teaching, and withdrawal from the world. Their forms are functional, their decoration limited, their purpose clear within Buddhist practice. Later, Hindu caves appear. These are more elaborate, filled with sculpted deities, mythological scenes, and architectural complexity. The cliff becomes a stage for divine narrative, where gods are carved at monumental scale and ritual movement is built directly into stone. Finally, Jain caves emerge at the northern end of the site. They are precise, refined, and intensely detailed, smaller in scale, but uncompromising in craftsmanship, reflecting Jain ideals of discipline and restraint. 3 religious traditions, 1 cliff, 400 years. What is missing is not evidence of coexistence, but any record explaining why this coexistence took place here and nowhere else like it. There is no surviving inscription that outlines a master plan, no foundation text that declares Ellora a sacred center, no account describing why Buddhist monks, Hindu patrons, and Jain communities all chose to carve their beliefs into the same rock face, rather than separating their sacred spaces as they did elsewhere. The most extraordinary structure at Ellora stands at the center of this silence. Cave 16, the Kailasa Temple, was carved not as a hollowed space, but as a freestanding temple excavated from the rock around it. Builders began at the top and worked downward, removing hundreds of thousands of tons of stone to reveal a complete architectural form. Towers, courtyards, stairways, sculpted walls, and towering reliefs, all integrated into a single monolith. It is dedicated to Shiva and symbolically represents Mount Kailash, the cosmic axis of the world. Its scale rivals constructed temples elsewhere in India, yet it was never assembled. It was released from the cliff. The technical achievement is undeniable, but the achievement is not the mystery. And here the silence deepens. Ellora is not mute because evidence is scarce. It is mute because explanation did not survive. Inscriptions exist, some record donors. Some mention later patrons or renovations. None explain why Ellora mattered more than any other site. None describe a shared vision, a founding moment, or a guiding purpose that unified centuries of work across religious boundaries. Art survives, iconography survives, architecture survives, but meaning does not. Modern scholars tend to describe Ellora not as a single religious center, but as a place whose significance evolved over time, a landscape that accumulated meaning rather than expressing one fixed intention. That explanation accounts for diversity, but not for commitment. It does not explain why labor on this scale continued uninterrupted, or why later builders chose proximity rather than separation. Ellora presents devotion without commentary, belief enacted at monumental scale without leaving behind the words to explain itself. The cliff still bears the marks of thousands of hands. The gods still emerge from stone. The monastery still open into darkness and quiet. What is gone is the reasoning that tied it all together, not lost through destruction, but through silence. Here silence preserves devotion. Elsewhere it conceals something far darker. Mass death usually leaves disorder. Bodies overlap, limbs tangle. The ground tells the story of haste and panic. Here it does not. The dead were placed carefully. They lie in rows. Their positions are deliberate. There is no evidence of a rushed burial, no collapse into chaos, no attempt to conceal what happened. Whoever laid these bodies into the earth took time to do it properly. This was not a battlefield. The site lies within a long-used burial landscape near the coast, an area where Athenians buried their dead for generations. Graves here normally follow custom, individual burials, offerings, signs of care. What makes this group different is not where they were buried, but how many were placed together, and how quietly. Archaeological analysis dates the burial to a period before Athens becomes the city it is later celebrated for. This is not the Athens of marble temples and written laws. It is an earlier society, still forming its institutions, still governed by elite families and shifting alliances. Written records from this time are sparse, but not absent, which makes the silence here harder to explain. At least 80 individuals were found together. Most were young adult males. Their bones show no signs of malnutrition or long-term illness. These were physically healthy people, not prisoners worn down by labor, not the chronically poor. Nothing in their remains suggests they lived at the margins of society. Then the restraints appear. Iron shackles still encircled some of their wrists. The metal had corroded, but the shape remained unmistakable. These were not symbolic objects. They were functional restraints, used to limit movement, used on more than one individual, applied with intention. This is the point where interpretation becomes unavoidable, but conclusions remain withheld. The bodies do not show the trauma typical of combat. There are no clustered weapon injuries, no signs of a violent clash. The arrangement suggests control, not chaos. Whatever ended these lives did not take place in open conflict. And here the mystery shifts. It is no longer a question of what happened. It is a question of why nothing says it did. Later, Athenian writers recorded political unrest in detail. They described coups, rival factions, civil violence and reform. They named leaders, listed grievances, and preserved memory, even when it reflected badly on the city. Athens did not shy away from documenting conflict, but this event does not appear. There is no surviving decree, no accusation, no justification. No later historian refers back to it. No myth transforms it into legend. The absence is total. Archaeologists can place the burial within a turbulent period, when power struggles between elite groups were common and outcomes could be brutal. But context does not equal explanation. Many violent episodes from this era left at least a trace in the written record. This one did not. What remains instead is physical proof, bodies, iron and careful arrangement, preserved where words are missing. This suggests a different kind of silence. Not history lost to time, but history excluded from it. An event that occurred before Athens learned how it wished to remember itself, or perhaps one it chose not to. The men buried here were not anonymous in life. Their deaths were not chaotic, their burial was not careless, and yet they left no story behind. The ground remembered what the record did not. But silence does not always erase in the same way, or with the same outcome. Cultures vanish in different ways. Some are destroyed by time. Others disappear because no one ever wrote them down. In the high Altai mountains of southern Siberia, neither of those things happened. The ground did not erase the dead here. It preserved them. Beneath low stone mounds scattered across windswept valleys, wooden burial chambers were sealed beneath layers of earth and rock. Soon after burial, meltwater seeped inside, froze and never thawed again. Ice filled the chambers completely, locking everything in place. Flesh, cloth, wood, leather, materials that usually disappear within decades, were suspended in time. The people buried here did not decay. They endured. Archaeologists call these burials Pazyryk, after one of the first sites excavated in the region. They belong to an Iron Age nomadic elite closely related to the wider Scythian world of the Eurasian steppe. Their lives were mobile, seasonal, and organized around herding, warfare, and ritual. But their deaths were anything but temporary. Each burial mound or kurgan was carefully planned. Timber chambers were constructed with precision. Bodies were placed deliberately, often accompanied by weapons, tools, textiles, and sacrificed horses arranged in formal positions. Nothing suggests haste. These were not emergency graves. They were performances of status prepared with time and intention. And then the ice took over. What survives inside these frozen tombs is extraordinary. Wool garments still hold their shape. Felt cloaks retain their color. Wooden objects show tool marks as if freshly carved. Even human skin remains intact, bearing tattoos so intricate they were invisible to the naked eye until modern imaging revealed them in detail. These tattoos are not casual decoration. Recent high-resolution analysis shows they were applied using multiple tools and stages, indicating trained specialists and shared symbolic language. Animal forms, deer, predators, composite creatures, coil across shoulders, backs, and limbs. The designs repeat across different burials, suggesting conventions understood by the living. Yet the meaning of those symbols is unknown. Everything that normally disappears survived here, except words. The Pazyryk people left no written language. No inscriptions appear on wood, stone, or metal. No marks identify names, clans, or deeds. No texts explain belief, hierarchy, or memory, and unlike Egypt or Greece, no neighboring civilization recorded them in detail either. Their voice was never transferred into durable form. Despite that absence, their world is laid bare. Their clothing reveals social rank. Layered textiles, imported dyes, and complex weaving techniques point to far-reaching connections across the steppe. The famous pile carpet recovered from one burial, the oldest known of its kind, demonstrates not only technical mastery but aesthetic planning. This was not functional craft alone, it was intentional design. Their weapons show readiness for conflict. Their horse gear reveals mobility and wealth. Entire horses were buried alongside elite individuals, carefully arranged and fully equipped. These were not symbolic gestures. Horses were central to identity, power, and survival. Even family structure becomes visible. Some burials include women of high status, children, and secondary interments, suggesting complex social relationships that extended beyond the individual. Status was inherited, expressed, and remembered, materially. And still, nothing explains it. We know how these people dressed. We know how they buried their dead. We know how they marked their bodies, armed their warriors, and honored their animals. But we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know how they described their world. We do not know what stories they told to make sense of it. The silence here is not the result of suppression or loss. It is structural. Meaning was transmitted through action, ritual, and material expression, not through text. What could be seen endured. What could be spoken did not. This makes the Pazyryk burials unusually honest. There is no later interpretation layered on top, no priestly explanation, no official account written centuries after the fact. What we see is what was left, and nothing more. Even now, the ice continues to dictate what survives. As permafrost thaws in the Altai, new discoveries emerge, but others are lost forever. The same process that preserved this culture for over 2,000 years is beginning to undo it. The silence may not last, but the voice will not return. The Pazyryk people did not disappear without trace. They disappeared without words. And that absence forces a distinction between cultures that are forgotten and cultures that were never recorded at all. When silence comes from erasure, it hides meaning. When silence comes from absence, it reveals how fragile meaning has always been. Sometimes the words did exist, written carefully, preserved deliberately, yet were set aside, ignored, or left out of history altogether. History usually falls silent when its sources are destroyed. Scrolls burn, stone erodes, memory collapses. But this silence is different. Here the words survived. The ideas did not. What remains are thin bamboo slips, narrow, fragile, once bound together with cord. They were never meant to last. Bamboo cracks, warps, rots. It bends under time long before stone does. And yet, against expectation, these slips endured, carrying with them a version of the past that history would later refuse to repeat. They are known today as the Rongcheng shoe texts. At first glance, there is nothing dramatic about them. No monument, no tomb, no spectacle carved into the landscape. Just writing, orderly, deliberate, carefully composed. These were not fragments or notes. They were arguments, structured, intentional, complete. They were meant to be read. The texts date to a time of intense intellectual competition. The Warring States period was not a cultural void waiting for order. It was an era crowded with ideas. Philosophers argued about governance, morality, legitimacy, and power. Schools rose, debated, and vanished. What later generations would call Chinese philosophy was still unsettled, contested, unfinished. The Rongcheng Shu belong fully to that world. Their language is confident. Their structure is precise. They retell early Chinese history, the age of legendary rulers. But they do so in a way that diverges sharply from the version most people recognize today. In these texts, authority does not pass automatically through bloodlines. Power is not inherited by default. Rulership is justified by conduct. The ideal leader is not crowned because he is born to rule. He is chosen because he governs well. Abdication is presented not as weakness, but as virtue, a moral act performed when a ruler recognizes someone more capable than himself. The early past is framed not as a chain of dynasties, but as a sequence of ethical decisions. This is not myth-making. It is political philosophy written backward into history. The names are familiar, legendary figures such as Yao, Shun, and Yu, but their meaning shifts. They are no longer symbols of inevitable succession. They become examples of judgment, restraint, and moral responsibility. Leadership in this telling is conditional. And this is where the problem emerges, because this version of the past does not align with the history that later became canonical. By the time Imperial China consolidated its historical narrative, legitimacy rested on continuity, on lineage, inheritance, and the authority of the throne. History became a stabilizing force, not a moral argument. The past was no longer a debate, it was a foundation. The Rongcheng do not support that foundation. And yet nothing suggests they were hidden, forbidden, or erased in their own time. They were written carefully, preserved deliberately, copied onto bamboo with the expectation of use. Their disappearance was not sudden, it was quiet. And here the mystery sharpens. These ideas were not destroyed, they were outlasted. There is no record of suppression, no decree banning their circulation, no trace of condemnation. Instead, the process is subtler and more difficult to confront. As certain philosophies gained influence, others stopped being copied. As official histories formed, alternative versions of the past were no longer needed. Texts that did not support the emerging structure simply ceased to travel forward in time. Survival became selective. The Rongcheng were not wrong in the eyes of their contemporaries. They were not marginal scribbles. They represent a coherent tradition that once stood alongside ideas that later triumphed. Their disappearance tells us less about their weakness than about the nature of historical memory itself. History does not preserve every voice. It preserves the voices that fit. What makes the Rongcheng unsettling is not what they say, but what their absence reveals. They show that the past we inherit is not simply what happened, it is what continued to be useful. Other cultures left silence because they left no writing. The Rongcheng leave silence because their writing was no longer wanted. The bamboo slips survived underground, removed from circulation beyond influence. When they resurfaced millennia later, they carried with them a reminder that history once had other paths available to it. Paths that were not taken, not because they failed, but because another version prevailed. There is no villain here, no single decision to erase. Only accumulation, repetition, authority hardening into tradition. The Rongcheng do not accuse the past, they expose it. They show that silence is not always caused by destruction. Sometimes it is caused by success, by the triumph of one story over all others. These texts were written carefully, preserved deliberately, left behind intentionally. Not because they were false, but because history chose a different voice to remember. These 7 mysteries remind us that the ancient world did not simply disappear. It went quiet in different ways. Names were lost, intentions went unrecorded, ideas survived but were not carried forward. What remains is not a complete past, but a selective one, shaped as much by silence as by survival. And somewhere beyond what we've uncovered, more histories still wait, unfinished, unspoken, unresolved. If one of them stayed with you, let it travel. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't. The search continues, here on RiddleMeThis Mysteries.